The gunshot was a crack of thunder in a world of white silence. It tore through the blizzard's howl, a single sharp note of defiance against the wind's endless, mournful song. Clara Winters lowered the heavy rifle from her shoulder, the cold of the steel biting through her woolen gloves. She raised her lantern higher, its small, flickering flame fighting a losing battle against the swirling, monstrous void of snow that surrounded her small cabin. Out in the stable, the mare had finally delivered her foal, a tiny, perfect miracle in this merciless, killing cold. A victory, but as Clara squinted into the oppressive darkness beyond the lantern's weak halo, that victory felt hollow. It felt small. The Montana winter of 1878 had arrived like a vengeful god, descending from the mountains early and with a fury that seemed personal. It felt as if the ancient peaks themselves had grown tired of the tiny humans scratching at their feet. 3 feet of snow had fallen in just 2 days, and the wind, a master sculptor of misery, had carved it into drifts tall enough to swallow a man whole, to erase him from the world without a trace. Clara had fired the shot as a signal, a desperate, lonely flare sent up into the storm. She was hoping someone, anyone, might hear it. She was hoping the men at the Caldwell Ranch would know she had succeeded, that she had saved their prized mare and its newborn. It was a small triumph, yes. But in a life like hers, small triumphs were all you had. She hoped it might, for just a moment, make the townsfolk remember she was more than what they called her. More than the witch on the hill. But the mountains offered no reply. They answered only with silence. The kind of silence that was so deep, so absolute, it felt like a physical weight pressing against your eardrums, squeezing the very air from your lungs, until it wasn't silent anymore. 3 deliberate knocks echoed against her door. Sharp, rhythmic, unmistakable. A pause, then one more. Clara froze. The lantern suspended from her hand swayed gently, casting dancing, frantic shadows. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the storm's roar. No one, absolutely no one, ventured up to her cabin in weather like this. The path up the ridge was a treacherous, ankle-snapping nightmare, even in the peak of summer. In this blizzard, it was a death sentence. And that knocking pattern, it wasn't random. It wasn't the clumsy rap of a lost traveler. It wasn't the expected response to her signal shot from the Caldwells. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate. A code. She set the lantern down on the rough-hewn table, her movements slow and careful. Her hand reached for the rifle she'd just fired. Empty. No time to reload it now. Still, the solid weight of it in her hands offered a sliver of comfort. Her bare feet were silent on the cold, rough wooden planks of the floor as she moved toward the door. The single room of her cabin was cast in a world of shadow and light. The fireplace at the far end threw long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced along the walls like restless spirits. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear coiling in her gut. She pressed her palm flat against the weathered wood of the door, feeling the vibrations of the wind through it. No answer came, only another knock, softer this time, almost hesitant. Clara steeled her nerves, her jaw tight. She took a deep breath, held the heavy, useless rifle like a club, and pulled the door open, just a crack. The man standing before her was a giant. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the entire doorframe. Snow was caked on him, dusting his hair and melting against the bare skin of his chest and arms. Bare skin, in a blizzard. The lantern light from inside caught on the deep, ugly groove of a scar. It started at his collarbone and ran down, disappearing across his ribs. A bullet wound, old and poorly healed. But it wasn't the scar or his impossible lack of clothing that held her. It was his eyes. They were dark and sunken, hollowed out with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to have carved itself into his bones. Yet beneath that weariness, they were sharp, alert, the eyes of a cornered animal. And in his arms he held a small bundle, a child, a little girl, no more than a year or two old, her tiny face an alarming shade of blue-gray. Each breath she took was a labored, ragged wheeze that tore at the silence. "She has pneumonia," the man said. His voice was a low, hoarse rasp, as if he hadn't used it in days. I heard you can heal. Clara's gaze darted past him, trying to pierce the wall of white that raged just beyond her doorstep. Who shot you? She asked, her voice sharp. The question seemed to catch him off guard. A muscle in his jaw tightened. 3 men, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. They're tracking me. They'll be here by dawn. He shifted the child in his arms, a movement of pure desperation. I'll leave as soon as the storm breaks. I swear it. But she needs help. Now. The child coughed again, a wet, crackling sound that clawed at Clara's heart. She recognized it instantly. Pneumonia, yes. But there was something else wrong. Something more. The girl's pupils were like pinpoints, her breathing dangerously shallow. There was no time for questions, no time for fear. There was only the child. Clara didn't hesitate. She opened the door wider. Bring her in, quickly. The man ducked his head to clear the low door frame, the storm seeming to shove him inside with an almost supernatural force. Clara slammed the heavy door shut behind him and threw the thick wooden bar across it. She knew a simple bar of wood would mean nothing if men with guns came hunting, but it felt like something. Put her on the bed, she instructed, gesturing to the small cot she kept near the warmth of the fireplace. What's her name? Grace, he said. He laid the child down with a gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with his large, roughened hands. Her name is Grace. Clara was already at the child's side, pressing her palm to the little girl's forehead. It was burning hot, a terrifying contrast to her blue-tinged lips. She began to unbutton the girl's sodden woolen coat, revealing a simple dress underneath. It might have once been fine cotton, but now it was stained, tattered, and worn thin. As she worked, she studied the man from the corner of her eye. He was tall, powerfully built, with dark hair cropped close to his skull. A prison cut, she guessed. His beard was short but untrimmed, and beneath the layers of dirt and sheer exhaustion, his features held an unexpected, almost aristocratic refinement. She's been drugged, Clara said, her voice suddenly sharp as steel. What did you give her? The man had sunk heavily into a chair by the table, his massive frame making the simple furniture look like it was built for a child. Laudanum, he admitted, his voice flat. It was the only medicine I had. Clara hissed through her teeth, a sound of pure fury. You gave laudanum to a baby? She could have died from an overdose. She was screaming, he shot back, his voice remaining level, but his hands, resting on his knees, tightened into white-knuckled fists. Screaming with fever, the men tracking us. They would have heard. He looked at her, his dark eyes pleading. I didn't know what else to do. Clara pushed aside her anger, forcing it down. It wouldn't help the child. She turned her focus back to Grace. She'd need willow bark for the fever, pine needle tea for the cough, and something strong to counteract the opium. The remedies came to her mind unbidden, a legacy from her mother, passed down through generations of Cherokee healers before the smallpox came and took her away. What's your name? She asked, already moving toward the shelves that lined the far wall, shelves crowded with glass jars of dried herbs, roots, and tinctures. There was a pause, a hesitation. Nathaniel Sullivan, he said finally. Nate. I'm Clara Winters. She didn't turn to see his reaction. She didn't need to. Everyone in 3 counties knew her name, or at least they knew the rumors that traveled with it. Witch, half-breed. The scarred woman on the mountain, the one who'd been left at the altar when Reverend Hammond's handsome son saw what the pox had done to her face. She gathered what she needed, willow bark, pine needles, a small vial of a powerful emetic, and returned to the bedside. Grace's wheezing had grown more pronounced, each breath a desperate struggle. As she gently lifted the child to remove her damp clothes, Clara's fingers brushed against something hard and unfamiliar. It was sewn into the very lining of the dress. She frowned, her fingers working deftly to free the object. It was a small folded piece of paper, carefully wrapped in oilskin to protect it from the elements. She unfolded it, and her eyes widened. She held it up, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. You're a doctor, she said, her voice filled with a new kind of shock. She was holding a medical certificate from the University of Pennsylvania, dated 1861. It read, Dr. Nathaniel Sullivan. The man, Nate, didn't move. His face was a mask carved from stone, giving nothing away. "I was a doctor," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "During the war. Now. Now I'm just a fugitive." "Fugitive from what?" His eyes shifted to the window, where the snow continued to press against the glass like a living thing, a hungry beast seeking entry. "Territorial prison," he said, the words falling like stones in the quiet cabin. "I was convicted of murder." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating as a hangman's rope. Clara should have been afraid. She should have reached for the empty rifle. She should have grabbed the skinning knife she kept tucked beneath her pillow. But she didn't. Instead, she found herself studying him with a cool, clinical detachment. It was a skill she'd honed as a battlefield nurse during the war that had torn the country apart. A war that had taught her more about men than she'd ever wanted to know. "Murder of whom?" she asked, her attention returning to Grace. The child needed her. The man's story could wait. "A woman," he said, his voice hollow, empty, "and her child." He looked up, and his eyes met hers in the flickering firelight. "But I didn't kill them. I tried to save them." Clara's hands stilled for just a moment before she resumed her work, mixing dried herbs with hot water from the kettle on the hearth. "Most men claim innocence when the noose is near. Most men aren't running towards something instead of away from it." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his massive frame radiating a desperate intensity. "I'm not asking you to believe me. Just help my daughter. Please." "Daughter." The word caught Clara completely by surprise. She looked from the dark-haired, pale-skinned man to the child on the bed. The little girl had golden brown skin and hair as black as a raven's wing. It was a heritage Clara recognized because it was her own. Reading the question in her eyes, Nate spoke again, his voice softer now. "Grace is my wife's child, from before we were married. But she's mine. In every way that matters, she's mine." Clara gave a single sharp nod, accepting this truth without comment. She, of all people, knew something of families built from things other than blood. She worked methodically, her hands sure and steady. She bathed Grace in lukewarm water infused with herbs to bring down the terrible fever. She prepared a thin broth of willow bark and honey to soothe her throat. As she worked, she spoke softly to the child, a constant, low murmur. It was an old habit from her nursing days. Sometimes the sound of a calm voice could reach through the haze of a fever when medicines couldn't. "I need to get some of this into her," she said, lifting a small cup of the medicine. "Can you hold her up?" Nate moved to the bedside instantly. His large hands, which had seemed so rough before, now cradled Grace's tiny form with a practiced, almost professional ease. Clara brought the cup to the child's lips, coaxing a small amount of the liquid between them. Grace coughed, a thin line of the medicine dribbling down her chin. But Clara persisted, gentle but firm, until the girl had swallowed at least half the dose. "Good," she murmured, wiping the child's chin. "That's good, little one." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury. It rattled the shutters like angry fists demanding to be let in. The blizzard was getting worse. No one would be traveling these mountains tonight, not even men desperate enough to track a fugitive through a killing storm. "You should rest," Clara said to Nate, her eyes still fixed on Grace. "There's food in the pot by the fire if you're hungry." "I don't sleep when others are watching," he replied, his voice even. Clara finally raised her eyes to his. A flicker of understanding passed between them. "Neither do I." The ghost of something, not quite a smile but a shared, grim acknowledgement, crossed his face. "Then we understand each other." Clara returned to her work, tending to Grace, but she was acutely aware of Nate's gaze on her, following her every movement. The child's breathing was still labored, a terrible rasping sound in the quiet room, but the awful blue tinge around her lips had begun to fade. Just a little. It would be hours before they knew. Hours of waiting to see if she would get better, or if she would slip away. "Why did you fire that shot?" Nate asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "Before I knocked." Clara glanced toward the window, now a solid pane of white. "The Caldwell mare," she said. "She foaled. The shot was to signal the ranch that they both survived." She tucked a clean, dry blanket around Grace's small body. "I deliver whatever needs delivering. She met his gaze. Foals, calves, babies. The town may call me a witch, but they still climb this mountain when their livestock is dying, or their wives are in difficult labor. But not for everyday ailments, he guessed. Clara's hand moved unconsciously to her face, her fingers tracing the pitted, ropey scars that marred her left cheekbone and jaw. They were a permanent legacy of the smallpox that had taken her mother and nearly claimed her as well. "Would you seek healing from a face like this?" she asked, her voice flat. "If you had any other choice?" Nate studied her for a long, quiet moment. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the smooth skin on one side and the damaged landscape of the other. "I've seen worse wounds on battlefield surgeons," he said, his voice soft. "The best ones. They always carried their own scars." Clara didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. Instead, she rose and moved to the far corner of the cabin, to a small, dark wooden trunk that sat beneath the only window not rattling from the storm's fury. From it, she withdrew a heavy, leather-bound journal, its pages worn soft and thin with years of handling. "My mother's remedies," she explained, returning to Grace's bedside. "She was Cherokee. She learned healing from her mother, who learned it from hers. When she married my father, a white doctor, they combined their knowledge." She flipped through the pages, the script a mix of her mother's elegant Cherokee syllabary and her father's precise English. She found what she was looking for, a detailed drawing of pine needles, alongside careful notes in two different hands. "This will help clear her lungs," she said, "but we need to get her fever down first." "Your parents," Nate said, watching her work. It wasn't a question, but an opening. "They're gone." Clara's voice was clinical, as if she were reciting a case history from a medical text. "Smallpox, 8 years ago. I survived. Barely." She didn't look up from the journal. "My father went first, then my mother, while she was nursing him." She paused, then added, her voice hardening just a little. "I was engaged to be married then. To the Reverend's son. He came to see me when I was recovering, and he found—" She gestured vaguely toward her scarred face. "He didn't come back." "I'm sorry," Nate said, his voice quiet. "Don't be," she said, closing the journal with a soft thud. "He showed his true nature before I bound my life to his." A bitter smile touched her lips. The town showed theirs, too. Nate's eyes narrowed. "Hammond? Was that his name?" Clara looked up, her head snapping toward him. A sudden cold unease washed over her. "Robert Hammond, son of Reverend Hammond, brother to James Hammond, the cattle baron." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "How did you know?" Nate's voice had turned to ice. "Hammond is a name I know well," he said, and the air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with unspoken history. "James Hammond," he said, his voice like stones grinding together, "was the witness who testified against me. The only witness." A chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard snaking through the cracks in the walls ran down Clara's spine. "James Hammond claimed you murdered a woman and child?" "A native woman," Nate clarified, his hands clenching into fists again. "And her husband, Morning Dove and John Blackfoot. They came to me for treatment when their little girl was sick with a fever. A week later, John was shot dead, supposedly for trespassing on Hammond land. Then, then Morning Dove and the child just disappeared." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Morning Dove? From the Blackfoot tribe?" Nate nodded slowly, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You've heard of her?" "My mother's cousin," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She married into the Blackfoot. They visited us once when I was a girl." She hesitated, the pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed beginning to swirl around her. "Hammond testified that you killed them?" "He claimed he saw me take them into my home in Cheyenne, and that they never came out again." Nate's eyes were distant, lost in a memory of injustice. "Said I buried them behind my surgery. They searched, dug up my entire property. They found no bodies. But it didn't matter. His word was enough. I was a Yankee doctor in a town that hadn't forgotten the war." Clara studied him, weighing his words, his bearing, the raw pain in his voice. She'd learned to read men during the war, the brave and the broken, the honest and the deceitful. Nate Sullivan carried guilt. That much was clear. But it wasn't the furtive, hollow shame of a murderer. It was something else. Grief. Rage. Why would Hammond lie? She asked. Land? Nate's answer was immediate, sharp, and certain. Mourning Dove's family held the rights to a valley, a beautiful valley where a creek fed into the Laramie River. Perfect cattle land, Clara finished for him. Exactly. After she and John disappeared, that land, it mysteriously became Hammond property. Clara's throat tightened. The story was sickeningly familiar. James Hammond had built his sprawling cattle empire using exactly those tactics right here in Montana. He acquired prime grazing land that had once belonged to native tribes or to small homesteaders who suddenly abandoned their claims or died under very questionable circumstances. Hammond wants my land too, she said, her voice quiet but firm. He's tried to buy it 3 times. Says a woman alone has no business holding on to prime acreage. What's so special about your land? Clara moved to the shelf beside the fireplace and filled a cup with water from a bucket she'd brought in earlier. Taste this. Nate took the cup, sipped from it hesitantly. His eyebrows shot up in surprise. It's sweet. Pure. There's a spring, she explained, taking the cup back. It runs deep beneath this ridge, feeds this cabin and flows all the way down to the valley. It never freezes, not even in the coldest winters. An unspoken understanding passed between them, as clear and cold as the spring water itself. They were both obstacles. 2 small, stubborn people standing in the way of a powerful man's boundless ambition. A man with money, connections, influence, and no apparent scruples about removing anyone who stood in his path. On the bed, Grace stirred, a small, pained whimper escaping her lips. Clara was at her side in an instant, placing a gentle hand on the child's forehead. Her fever's rising again, she said, a new urgency in her voice. We need to cool her down. She soaked a cloth in water mixed with vinegar and placed it on Grace's forehead. Then she began to unbutton the child's thin shift to place more cool cloths on her chest and under her small arms. As her fingers worked at the nape of the child's neck, they brushed against something, a small birthmark, a perfect crescent shape, darker than the surrounding skin. Clara froze. Her breath caught in her chest. What is it? Nate asked, his voice sharp with alarm. She touched the mark again, tracing its perfect curve, her mind reeling. Then she met his eyes. This birthmark, she said, her voice barely a whisper. My mother had one just like it, in the exact same place. She said it ran in her family, the women especially. Nate frowned, leaning closer to see. Elizabeth, my wife, she said it came from Grace's father, a family trait. Clara's mind was racing, connecting dots that were decades apart. Your wife, what was her name before you were married? Rivers, he said, watching her face carefully. Elizabeth Rivers. Why? My mother's cousin, Clara said, her voice growing more urgent with every word. The one who married into the Blackfoot. Her name was River Woman. They anglicized it to Rivers when the agents from the Bureau came through with the census. Her heart was hammering now. When was Grace born? 2 years ago, April. And Mourning Dove's daughter? The little girl who came to you for treatment? How old was she? Nate's eyes widened slightly as he finally followed the path of her thoughts. 3, maybe 4 years old. Not the same child then. Clara wasn't sure if she felt relief or disappointment. The connection had seemed so certain, so powerful for a moment. A sign, perhaps, that helping this man and this child was not some random act of chance, but a thread in a much larger tapestry. I'm sorry, she said, turning her attention back to Grace. For a moment I thought Grace was somehow connected to Mourning Dove. Nate shook his head slowly. No, but the coincidence. It's strange. Clara nodded, her focus returning to the immediate, life-or-death struggle of bringing down Grace's raging fever. The storm continued its assault outside, the snow piling up against the windows in thick, suffocating drifts that dimmed what little moonlight might have pierced the clouds. The cabin creaked and moaned like a ship in a storm, but it held firm against the wind's relentless attack. For hours they worked together in a state of near silence. They moved around each other with the practiced, unspoken efficiency of people accustomed to sick rooms and desperation. Nate built up the fire when it began to falter. He found clean cloths when she needed them. He held Grace steady when Clara had to administer another dose of the bitter medicine. Clara saw the doctor in him then. She saw it in the precise way he monitored the child's pulse and breathing, in the careful, gentle way he supported her head when she coughed. Sometime near midnight, Grace's fever finally broke. The terrible heat that had radiated from her small body like a forge began to recede. Her breathing eased, losing its ragged, desperate edge. She finally fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. Clara sank into a chair, the exhaustion of the last day and night crashing down on her like a physical blow. She hadn't slept in nearly 20 hours, not since the ranch hand from the Caldwell place had brought the laboring mare up the mountain trail. "She'll sleep now," she said, rubbing her tired eyes. "We should too. You can take the bed. I'll take the chair." "I told you," Nate replied, his voice soft but firm. "I don't sleep when others are watching." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him. She saw the bone-deep weariness that never truly left his eyes. She saw the way he had instinctively positioned himself with his back to the wall, always aware of the door. She saw the constant, humming alertness that spoke of months, maybe years, of unrelenting vigilance. "How long were you in prison?" she asked softly. 14 months, he said, his voice flat. "Would have been executed last week if I hadn't escaped during a prisoner transfer." "And Grace, where was she all that time?" "With Elizabeth." A flash of raw, unbearable pain crossed his features. "My wife, she died 3 months ago. Childbirth. The baby, too." He swallowed hard. "Her sister kept Grace for me until I could find them after I escaped." Clara closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this new layer of tragedy. This man's story was a litany of loss. "I'm so sorry." Nate just nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. He rose and moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the thick frost that coated the glass. "The storm's weakening," he said. "Dawn will be here in a few hours." "And the men tracking you," Clara said. "They'll come." His certainty was chilling. "Bounty hunters. $500 for my capture. More if I'm dead. Saves them the trouble of a hanging." Clara watched him. This man who had endured prison, lost his wife and newborn son, and was now risking his life for his adopted daughter. A doctor accused of murder. A father willing to walk bare-chested through a blizzard. "Why come to me?" she asked suddenly. "There are doctors closer to town, safer options." Nate turned from the window, his silhouette dark against the pale frosted glass. "I heard story," he said. "Stories about a woman healer up in the mountains. Someone who helped the people others turned away." He glanced at Grace, sleeping peacefully now. "Someone who might understand what it's like to be judged for what you look like, instead of for who you are." The simple truth of his words settled over Clara like a physical weight. She had built her entire solitary life around that very reality. The knowledge that most people saw only her scars, her mixed blood, the whispered legends of witchcraft that clung to her name like a shroud. She'd learned to use their fear, to turn it into a kind of shield, a kind of power. But she'd never, ever stopped feeling its sting. "Rest," she said again, her voice softer this time. "I'll watch Grace." And the door. To her surprise this time, Nate nodded. He moved to the hearth and sat on the floor beside it, leaning his back against the warm stones. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Though Clara noticed his hand never strayed far from his boot, where she suspected a knife was hidden. Clara kept her vigil. She checked on Grace periodically while her eyes constantly scanned the windows, watching for any sign of movement outside. The storm was indeed weakening. The wind's furious howl had diminished to an occasional low moan. Soon the moon broke through a gap in the clouds, casting a magical, silver light across the snow-transformed landscape. In that ethereal glow, Clara studied the sleeping child more carefully. Grace's features were a delicate blend, hinting at her native heritage. The high cheekbones, the straight black hair. But there was something else, too. something familiar that Clara couldn't quite place. She gently turned the child's head to see the crescent birthmark again. Her mother had called it the moon's touch, a blessing from the night sky that marked certain women in their family line for generations. Clara remembered being disappointed as a child that she had been born without it, while her cousins all displayed it proudly. On a sudden impulse, she retrieved her mother's journal again. She opened it to the family records meticulously kept in the back. Birth dates, marriages, deaths, all recorded in her mother's careful hand. She traced the entries with her finger until she found what she was looking for. Her mother's cousin, River Woman, who had married into the Blackfoot tribe. The entry noted that River Woman had a daughter. Her name was Morning Star. Born in 1853, Clara's heart began to beat faster. Morning Star, the English speakers, the agents, they would have translated that as dawn, or morning dove. She turned the pages, her fingers trembling now, looking for any other mention of Morning Star's life after she had left the family. And there it was, a small, faded note, dated 1871. Morning Star's daughter born, named Grace, after my mother. Clara's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She looked from the journal to the sleeping child, then back to the date. Grace, born in 1871. But Nate had said his Grace was only 2 years old, born in 1876. Either he was lying, or Clara moved silently to where Grace slept. Gently, carefully, she checked inside the child's mouth. New teeth, still coming in. The size and development were exactly right for a child of around 2 years of age. Not 7. It wasn't the same Grace then, but the birthmark, it was identical to her family's mark. And the name, it was too much. The coincidence was too great to be a coincidence at all. As the first pale hint of dawn approached, Clara made her decision. When Nate stirred from his sleep, instantly alert, as those accustomed to danger always are, she was waiting for him. She had a cup of fresh coffee ready and her mother's journal was open on the table before her. "Your Grace isn't Morning Dove's daughter," she said, without any preamble, "but I believe Morning Dove was my cousin." Nate took the offered cup, his eyes never leaving hers as he processed her words. "What are you saying?" "Morning Dove's real name was Morning Star," Clara explained, tapping the open page of the journal. "She was my mother's cousin's daughter, and she had a daughter of her own, named Grace, born in 1871. "That's impossible," Nate said, shaking his head. "My Grace is 2 years old. She was born to Elizabeth in 76. "I know they aren't the same child," Clara met his gaze steadily. "But the birthmark Grace has, it's a family trait. It runs through my mother's line, which means that somehow your wife, Elizabeth, was related to Morning Dove." Nate's brow furrowed in confusion. Elizabeth never spoke of any native heritage. "Many don't," Clara said, her voice gentle, "especially those who can pass as white." Nate set down his cup, his hands suddenly unsteady. "Elizabeth was a nurse during the war. That's where we met. She never spoke of her family. Said they all died when she was young." He looked over at Grace, still sleeping peacefully, an innocent angel in a world of secrets and lies. "But the birthmark, she told me it came from Grace's father." "Perhaps it did," Clara considered. "Or perhaps Elizabeth herself carried mixed blood. Perhaps she was hiding it." She closed the journal. "Either way, the connection is there. It's too strong to be a coincidence." The implications hung between them like thick smoke, too complex to grasp fully, yet impossible to wave away. If Elizabeth was related to Morning Dove, even distantly, then Grace's own heritage was directly connected to the very people Nate had been accused of murdering. And Clara, by blood, was connected to them all. "What does this mean?" Nate asked finally, his voice low. Clara took a deep, steadying breath. "It means we need to find out what really happened to Morning Dove and her child. And it means the men hunting you aren't just after a bounty. They're not just trying to silence a fugitive." She met his eyes, the terrible truth settling between them. "They're protecting someone's secrets, Hammond's secrets." Nate nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "If Hammond killed Morning Dove and her family for their land, and then framed you for it," Clara continued, her voice low and intense, "then Grace could be in danger too. especially if there's any chance she could inherit a claim to that land through her mother, Elizabeth. I have to get her away from here. Nate stood, his body tensing, already moving toward the door. Far away, somewhere Hammond can't reach her. Wait! Clara rose too, blocking his path. Her small frame was no match for his, but her presence was a force he couldn't ignore. Running won't solve this. If Hammond is behind all of this, if he's willing to hang an innocent man and murder a woman and child for land, then he will never stop hunting you, or Grace. What's the alternative? He demanded, his voice raw with frustration. Turn myself in? I'd be dead before I could speak a single word of the truth. Clara squared her shoulders, a decision crystallizing within her, hard and clear as ice. We go to town, she said, together, and we find proof of what Hammond did. Nate stared at her as if she just suggested they fly to the moon. That's suicide. No, Clara's voice hardened, taking on a strength she hadn't felt in years. It's the only way to end this. I have spent years hiding on this mountain, letting the town's fear keep me safe, but alone. I'm tired of it, and I'm tired of men like James Hammond taking whatever they want, from whomever they want. Outside, the first true light of dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in breathtaking shades of rose and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, pristine, dangerous, and achingly beautiful. Clara moved to the window, watching as a single raven took flight from a nearby pine, its black wings a stark contrast against the snow-bright sky. Her mother would have called it an omen. They'll come for you soon, she said, not turning around. Those bounty hunters. We can either wait for them here, trapped like rats, or we can choose the battlefield. Nate was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It was more resolved, less hunted. You'd risk yourself for us, for strangers. Why? Clara finally turned to face him, the morning light catching the scars on her face, illuminating them not as flaws, but as a map of her survival. Because Mourning Dove was family, she said, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. Because Grace carries our blood. Because Hammond has taken enough from all of us. She straightened to her full height. And because it's time someone finally stood against him. On the bed, Grace stirred, her small face peaceful in her sleep, blissfully unaware of the dangers and decisions swirling around her. The child who had brought them together, this unlikely pair, the scarred healer and the fugitive doctor, both outcasts, both survivors. What do you propose? Nate asked, his voice now that of a soldier planning a campaign. Clara's eyes gleamed with a purpose she thought she'd lost forever. First, we need to speak with someone in town who might help us. Esther Caldwell, the widow whose mare just foaled. She's the only person in Millwood who still treats me like a human being. She took a breath. And then we find proof that Hammond murdered Mourning Dove and her husband. Clara's voice grew still, her words precise and chilling. We find the bodies. Nate's expression darkened. If they even exist. Oh, they exist, Clara said, a grim certainty settling over her. Hammond would never have risked leaving them alive, and he's arrogant enough to believe that no one would ever dare to look too closely. She moved to a trunk near her bed and pulled out a clean dress. It was simple, practical, but far better than her current homespun attire. We have a few hours before the trails are passable. I need to gather medicines for Grace and supplies for the journey. As she spoke, a sound reached them from the valley below, distant but unmistakable, the baying of hounds. Nate was at the window in an instant, his body tensing like a coiled spring. They're coming, he said, his voice tight. Sooner than I expected. Clara joined him, peering out at the vast white expanse below. In the far distance, 3 riders were visible, dark specks moving against the snow, accompanied by the smaller, frantic shapes of tracking dogs. Bounty hunters, Nate confirmed grimly. They'll be here within the hour. Clara's mind raced. They weren't ready. Grace was still weak. Their plan was barely formed. But waiting meant certain capture. It meant losing the one small advantage they had left. Surprise. Change of plans, she said, her voice calm and decisive as she began to move, gathering essentials with an efficiency born of long practice. We leave now. We take the north trail down the ridge. It's steeper, but it's less visible from the main path. We can reach the Caldwell Ranch before they can cut us off. Nate nodded, lifting Grace gently from the bed and wrapping her in the warmest blanket he could find. The child stirred but didn't wake, still exhausted from her ordeal. Clara dressed quickly, adding layers of wool against the bitter cold. She filled a leather satchel with medicines, food, her mother's journal, and the few small valuables she couldn't bear to leave behind. Last, she took down the rifle that hung above the door, and with steady, practiced hands, she loaded it. "You know how to use that?" Nate asked, eyeing the weapon with a professional curiosity. Clara leveled him with a look that answered more eloquently than any words could. She had survived alone in these mountains for 8 years. Of course, she knew how to use a rifle. They stepped outside into the harsh, blinding brilliance of the morning. The snow reached past their knees in places, but the sky above was a perfect, painful, impossible blue. Clara led the way to the small, sturdy stable behind the cabin, where the mare and her newborn foal rested in the relative warmth of fresh hay. "We can't take her," Clara said, stroking the mare's nose apologetically. "Not with the foal so new, but we need my gelding." She moved to the second stall, where a sturdy mountain horse greeted her with a soft nicker. Within minutes, she had him saddled and ready. "I'll ride," she said, mounting with a practiced ease that belied her heavy skirts. "You hold Grace. Stay low against my back." Nate hesitated for only a fraction of a second before handing the precious bundle of his daughter up to Clara. Then he swung himself up onto the horse behind them. The gelding snorted at the unusual weight but held steady. "The North Trail," Clara reminded him, pointing toward a narrow, almost invisible path that wound between thick pines at the edge of her property. "It joins with the old mining road about 3 miles down. From there we can reach the Caldwell place without being seen from the main trail." Nate's arm tightened around her waist as he balanced Grace between them. "Clara," he said, his voice low and serious, "if this goes wrong—" "It won't," she cut him off, her voice sharp. "But if it does, we face it together." She turned in the saddle, her scarred cheek just inches from his. She met his eyes and he saw the fire burning there. "I'm done hiding, Dr. Sullivan. Are you?" Something shifted in his gaze. A flicker of awe, perhaps. A recognition of the fierce, unbreakable spirit that had allowed this woman to survive alone when so many others would have broken. He gave a single, firm nod. Clara turned forward and urged the gelding into motion. They moved away from the cabin at a careful trot, the horse finding sure footing despite the deep, treacherous snow. Behind them, the baying of the hounds grew louder, more urgent. The hunters had caught their scent. As they disappeared into the sheltering darkness of the pines, Clara glanced back one last time at the small cabin that had been both her sanctuary and her prison for so long. A thin plume of smoke still rose from the chimney, a welcoming beacon that would lead the bounty hunters straight to her empty door. Let them come, she thought, a cold, hard resolve settling in her heart. The scarred witch of the mountain was through with hiding. The gelding picked up speed as they hit the tree line, and Clara bent low over his neck, one hand steady on the reins, the other holding Grace secure against her chest. Nate's weight was a solid, reassuring presence behind her, his breathing controlled and steady, despite the pace and the ever-present danger. Together, they raced the rising sun toward a confrontation that was long overdue. A confrontation with men who hunted other men for bounty, with a town that judged by appearance, and with the powerful, unseen forces that had torn both their lives apart. Behind them, the hounds' baying turned triumphant as they finally reached the empty cabin. The hunt had begun in earnest now, but for the first time in years, Clara Winters wasn't the prey. She was a hunter, too. The gelding's hooves were like pistons, punching through the snow's brittle crust. Each powerful stride sent up crystalline clouds that sparkled like diamond dust in the cold morning light. Clara pushed the horse hard, maintaining a steady, ground-eating pace, fast enough to put distance between them and their pursuers, but careful enough to navigate the treacherous northern trail, a path so hidden and difficult that few besides herself ever dared to travel it. Pressed against her chest, Grace stirred. The child's small hands clutched feebly at the front of Clara's woolen coat. Her fever had broken during the night, But pneumonia was a stubborn beast. It didn't release its victims easily. Every jarring step of the horse drew a tiny, pitiful whimper from the little girl. "She needs rest," Nate said, his voice close to Clara's ear, a low rumble against the rhythmic pounding of hooves. "And warmth." "The Caldwell place is less than an hour ahead," Clara replied without slowing. "Esther will help us. She has to." They rode in a tense silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the mountain trail wound its way downward through dense stands of lodgepole pine. The forest was eerily quiet, hushed and heavy in the aftermath of the storm. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the heavy labored breathing of their horse, and the soft whisper of snow falling from overloaded branches. Twice they stopped, pulling the horse to a halt in the shelter of a thicket to listen for sounds of pursuit. The first time, the distant baying of the hounds still echoed from the ridge high above them, a faint, menacing promise. The second time, nearly half an hour later, they heard nothing but the soft, gentle drip of melting snow from the pine boughs. "They're still tracking," Nate said with grim certainty. "The dogs can't follow our scent through all this fresh powder, but they're not fools. They'll find where the trail emerges from the trees, and they know we're headed down the mountain." Clara nodded, her jaw tight. "Then we'd better make good use of our head start." The sun climbed higher, its light reflecting off the endless sea of white, turning the snow-covered landscape blindingly bright. By mid-morning, they reached the junction where the narrow mountain trail finally met the wider, abandoned mining road. Here the snow was marked with other tracks, the delicate prints of deer, the heavier tread of a wolf pack, and the occasional mark of another traveler who had been brave or foolish enough to brave the winter paths. "This way," Clara said, steering the gelding east along the road. "The Caldwell Ranch lies just beyond that next rise." As they crested the hill, the valley opened up before them like a page from a book. The Caldwell Ranch sprawled across the lowlands, a collection of sturdy, well-built buildings nestled against the protective base of the foothills. Smoke rose in steady, reassuring columns from two chimneys, and in the nearest pasture, a herd of hardy cattle huddled together against the lingering cold. Clara felt Nate tense behind her. "Open ground," he muttered, his voice low and worried. "We're too exposed." "We have no choice," she replied, urging the horse forward. "Besides, Esther Caldwell is our best hope for an ally in all of Millwood." They descended toward the ranch, the gelding picking up speed as the snow thinned on the sunlit slopes. As they approached the main house, a figure emerged onto the wide-covered porch. It was a woman, her hair the color of silver, pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She was wrapped in a heavy shawl against the morning chill. Esther Caldwell shaded her eyes against the glare of the snow, her gaze sweeping across the valley. Then she straightened, her posture stiffening as recognition dawned. "Clara Winters," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still cold air. "Is that you, child?" Clara raised a hand in greeting as they drew closer. "Mrs. Caldwell, we need your help." The older woman's gaze sharpened as she took in the strange, desperate tableau before her. Clara on horseback, a large, bare-chested man sitting behind her, and a small child bundled tightly between them. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, widened in sudden, dawning understanding. "The escaped prisoner," she said, her voice dropping, all the warmth gone from it. "They've been talking about him in town. Said he murdered a woman and her child." Nate stiffened behind Clara, but she spoke before he could, her voice clear and urgent. "He's innocent, Mrs. Caldwell. He was framed by James Hammond." She dismounted carefully, cradling Grace in her arms. "This is his daughter. She has pneumonia. We need shelter, just for a few hours." Esther's weathered face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, compassion warring with caution, fear warring with loyalty. Her gaze lingered on Grace's small, still form, then moved to Nate, assessing him, measuring him. "You're the doctor," she said. It wasn't a question, but a statement. "The one from Cheyenne." Nate nodded, dismounting with a fluid, silent grace that belied his size. "Yes, ma'am." Esther looked back at Clara, her sharp eyes searching Clara's face. "And you trust this man?" "I do." Clara's voice held not a shred of doubt. The older woman let out a long, heavy sigh. Then so will I, she declared, her decision made. God knows Clara Winters doesn't give her trust away easily. She gestured toward the house with a decisive nod. Get inside, quickly. My boys are out checking the north pasture, but they'll be back by noon. They followed her into the house, the warmth from the well-tended hearth washing over them like a blessing. The Caldwell home spoke of a modest, hard-won prosperity. The furniture was solid and practical, the floors were scrubbed clean, and the walls were adorned with simple but elegant needlework. Esther led them to a small, cozy bedroom off the main living area. Put the child here, she directed, pulling back a thick quilt on the bed. I'll fetch more blankets and some hot water. Clara laid Grace gently on the bed, her practiced hands immediately checking the child's pulse and breathing. The journey had clearly exhausted the little girl, but her color was already better than it had been at the cabin. The terrible blue tinge was almost gone. She needs willow bark tea, Clara said, looking up at Esther, and honey for her throat. I have both, Esther replied, returning with an armful of heavy woolen blankets and a steaming kettle. She set them down, then fixed Nate with a penetrating stare. Now, young man, I have a shirt of my late husband's that might fit your shoulders. We can't have you catching your death too. Despite the danger, despite the fear, Clara felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. Esther Caldwell had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 strong sons all by herself on this unforgiving land. She was not a woman who was easily intimidated, even by a man of Nate's imposing stature. While Esther bustled about, tending to Grace with Clara's quiet guidance, Nate donned the offered shirt. It was too short in the sleeves and tight across the chest, but it was better than nothing. He took up a position by the front window, his body still and watchful, his eyes scanning the long approach to the ranch. Suddenly he stiffened. 3 riders coming, he said, his voice low and taut with tension. With dogs. Clara and Esther exchanged alarmed glances. The bounty hunters, Clara said, her heart sinking. They've tracked us faster than I thought possible. Esther moved to the window, peering out from beside Nate. A grim, hard look settled on her face. Those aren't just any bounty hunters, she said, her voice like flint. That's Silas Webb and his brothers. They do Hammond's dirty work. Hammond? Clara's pulse quickened. James Hammond hired them? Who else pays $500 for a prisoner who's already been sentenced to hang? Esther turned from the window, her face pale. There's more to this than a simple bounty hunt. Hammond wants this man dead. Nate's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out in sharp relief. He wants to make sure I never get the chance to tell what I know about Mourning Dove and her husband. Esther's eyes widened. Mourning Dove? The Indian woman who disappeared down near Cheyenne? She sat down heavily in a nearby rocking chair. Lord above, I knew that story never smelled right. You've heard of her? Clara asked, surprised. My sister lives in Cheyenne, Esther explained, shaking her head slowly. She wrote to me about it when it happened, said it was the strangest thing. How that poor woman and her child just vanished into thin air right after her husband was shot. And how quick everyone was to blame the Yankee doctor, even without a body or a single piece of real evidence. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention back to the window. The 3 riders had reached the ranch yard. They were rough-looking men with the cold, hard expressions of those who hunted human beings for profit. The oldest of the 3, a man with a grizzled beard and dead eyes, presumably Silas Webb, dismounted and strode purposefully toward the house, while his 2 brothers struggled to control the straining, frantic hounds. You 2, get in the back bedroom, Esther ordered, her voice firm and commanding. Take the child. I'll deal with Silas Webb. Mrs. Caldwell, Clara began to protest, but the older woman cut her off with a sharp, impatient gesture. I buried my first husband after the Battle of Antietam, and I buried my second after a Blackfoot raid, she said, her eyes flashing with a fire that defied her age. I have faced down worse men than Silas Webb. Her expression softened for just a moment as she looked at them. Now go, protect that child. They retreated into the bedroom with Grace just as a heavy, authoritative knock sounded at the front door. Through the thin wooden walls, they could hear Esther greeting the visitor with a convincing, neighborly cordiality. Mr. Webb, what on earth brings you all the way out to my door on such a cold morning? Webb's voice was a gravelly rasp, all business. Tracking a fugitive, Mrs. Caldwell, an escaped murderer, and the woman who's helping him. Seen anyone pass this way? Can't say that I have. Esther's tone remained pleasant, unruffled. My boys are out checking the north pasture. If they'd seen any strangers, they would have told me. Mind if we look around? Webb pressed. Got dogs that can smell a man through 3 feet of snow. There was a short pause. Well, I suppose that would be all right, Esther said, her voice laced with just the right amount of weary reluctance. Though I don't appreciate having hounds anywhere near my chickens. I lost 3 to a pack of wolves just last month. In the bedroom, Nate moved silently to the window, his fingers testing its latch. We need to go, he whispered, his voice urgent. Now. Clara nodded, gathering the sleeping Grace into her arms. The window opened silently, revealing a clear drop to the side yard, where a large woodpile offered a small amount of cover. Beyond that stretched 50 yards of open, snow-covered pasture, and then the blessed dark shelter of a small copse of trees. They would be terribly, terrifyingly exposed. Outside, they could hear Webb shouting instructions to his brothers, telling them to search the barn and the outbuildings. Suddenly, one of the hounds began to bay frantically, its nose to the ground, its body quivering. It had caught a scent. Dr. Sullivan, Webb called out, his voice carrying clearly into the house. We know you're in there. Come on out, peaceful-like, and the woman and child won't be harmed. Nate's expression hardened into a mask of pure resolve. Stay here, he said to Clara, his voice a low growl. I'll draw them off. No. Clara's grip on his arm was surprisingly strong, her knuckles white. We stay together. The hound bayed again, closer now, followed by the heavy sound of boots on the porch steps. They were out of time. They were trapped. Clara made a swift, desperate decision. She pressed Grace into Nate's arms, her eyes locking with his. Trust me, she whispered. Then she moved to the bedroom door, pulled it open, and stepped out into the main room. Esther stood like a statue, facing Silas Webb, who had one muddy boot already across the threshold of her home. I'm the one you want, Clara said, her voice ringing out, clear and steady. She drew herself up to her full height, meeting the bounty hunter's cold gaze without flinching. I'm the one who helped Dr. Sullivan escape. Webb's weathered face registered surprise, then a flicker of cold calculation as he took in her scarred features. You're the witch woman from up on the mountain. I am, Clara lifted her chin, a defiant fire in her eyes. And Dr. Sullivan is long gone. I sent him west at dawn, on one of my fresh horses. Webb's eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. You're lying. Am I? Clara allowed a thin, cold smile to touch her lips. Ask your dogs which direction the scent leads. It leads west, along the old mining road. It was a gamble, a desperate, long shot. The dogs had clearly tracked them directly to the ranch. But with luck, with a miracle, the scent trail might have continued past it, following the road they would have taken had they not stopped for help. Webb hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his harsh features. Search the house, he snarled to one of his brothers, who had now joined him on the porch. Now see here, Esther protested, her voice bristling with indignation. I have allowed your questions, Mr. Webb, but I draw the line at strange men tramping through my home without just cause. The cause is $500, dead or alive, Webb snapped back. And harboring a fugitive is a hanging offense, Mrs. Caldwell, even for a respectable widow like yourself. The younger Webb brother pushed past Clara, his eyes scanning the room, heading straight for the bedroom where Nate and Grace were hidden. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had bought them seconds, not minutes. Suddenly, a loud crash from outside drew everyone's attention. Through the open door, they could see the third Webb brother sprawled out in the snow beside the barn, as if he'd been struck from behind by an invisible force. His dog danced in agitated circles around him, barking frantically. What in the devil? Webb began, turning his head. He never finished the sentence. Nate appeared behind him, as if materialized from the shadows themselves. One powerful arm locked around the bounty hunter's throat in a silent, deadly chokehold. Webb clawed uselessly at the constricting arm, his eyes bulging with shock and fear. Then his body went limp. Nate lowered him carefully to the floor. "He's just unconscious," he assured Esther, who had pressed a hand to her mouth in shock. "Where's the other one?" His answer came in the form of a pistol being cocked. The younger Webb brother stood in the bedroom doorway, his weapon leveled squarely at Nate's chest. "Don't you move," he snarled, his face pale but his hand steady, "or I'll put a hole through you that no doctor can fix." Clara, positioned just behind the young man, acted on pure instinct. As she had passed the stove, she had grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet. Now she brought it down on the back of Webb's head with all the strength she possessed. He crumpled to the floor without a sound. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the floorboards. For a long moment, an absolute silence reigned in the Caldwell home, broken only by the frantic, panicked barking of the dogs outside. "Good Lord," Esther breathed, looking at the two unconscious men on her floor. "I'm harboring fugitives and assaulting bounty hunters. At my age." "Grace?" Clara asked urgently, her eyes finding Nate's. "Still sleeping," Nate replied, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Didn't even wake up at the gunshot." He looked from the unconscious men to Esther, his mind already working. "We need to leave. Now. More will come when these three don't return." Esther nodded briskly, her natural practicality reasserting itself. "You'll need supplies and a wagon. You can't travel far on horseback with a sick child." She moved to a cabinet, pulling out a small, heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "Take this, and take whatever food you can carry from the pantry." "Mrs. Caldwell, we can't," Clara began. "You can and you will," the older woman interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "That mare and foal you saved for me are worth 10 times this much." She pressed the pouch firmly into Clara's hands. "Now go, before my boys get back. They're good lads, but they gossip in town." Within 10 minutes, they had loaded a small, sturdy wagon with supplies, food, blankets, the medicines from Clara's satchel, and the still sleeping Grace, nestled securely in a warm nest of quilts. Nate harnessed one of Esther's steadiest draft horses to the wagon, while Clara secured her own gelding to the back. "What about them?" Clara asked, nodding toward the house where the three Webb brothers now lay, bound with rope, in Esther's cold root cellar. "They'll keep until my sons get back," Esther said grimly. "By then, you'll be far enough away that it won't matter what lies they tell." She took both of Clara's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong. "Head for Miller's Crossing. My cousin Isaac runs the general store there. Tell him I sent you. He'll help you." Clara embraced the older woman, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. "Thank you." Esther patted her back gruffly. "You saved my prized mare and her foal. This just squares us." She stepped back, her eyes glinting with what might have been unshed tears. "Now go, and be careful. James Hammond has a long reach." Nate took the reins, helping Clara up onto the wagon seat beside him. Grace slept on, nestled between them, wrapped in the warmest quilts Esther owned. "Miller's Crossing?" Nate confirmed. "How far?" 20 miles east, Clara replied, her mind already calculating the journey ahead. "We can make it by nightfall if the roads are passable." They set off, the wagon creaking under its load as it rolled out of the ranch yard. Clara looked back once to see Esther standing in her doorway, a solitary, resilient figure against the vast white landscape, her hand raised in a silent farewell. They were headed east, away from Millwood, away from Hammond's immediate sphere of influence. But as the wagon jolted down the snow-covered road, Clara knew they weren't truly fleeing. They were circling, gathering strength, preparing for the real confrontation that was still to come. If you enjoy stories of survival and justice, don't forget to subscribe.